I returned from my visit to Vietnam late last night, about midnight, and this is my first opportunity to comment on the terrible events over the last 24 to 36 hours. Can I start by expressing my deepest condolence to the families, the friends and the mates of the 5 Australian soldiers who have been killed in 2 separate instances in Afghanistan over the last day or so. Can I also express my condolences and best wishes to the families of our 2 wounded soldiers, both of whom remain in a satisfactory condition. I received this terrible news in Hanoi in the early hours of yesterday morning. I was in Hanoi with the Secretary of the Department of Defence, Duncan Lewis. We immediately realised the very deep significance of these terrible events. Multiple fatalities arising from 2 separate instances, and our largest day in the field in combat or in war since Vietnam, and the fact that we were in Hanoi itself added to that moment. We immediately spoke to the Secretary. The Secretary and I immediately spoke to the Chief of the Defence Force, General Hurley, who was himself in Indonesia, and we both arranged to return to Australia, and I'll be speaking to General Hurley again later this morning. I'm not in a position to update further details so far as the Australian fatalities are concerned. The Department of Defence is still going through its procedures, and the families continue to ask us to respect their privacy at this time. But at an appropriate stage in the next day or so, further details will be provided. As I've indicated, the 2 wounded soldiers remain in a satisfactory condition. Because we're dealing with 2 separate instances here, let me firstly deal with the so-called green on blue incident. They're described as green on blue incidences or insider incidents because the colour coding that NATO and ISAF use is green for the Afghan National Army and blue for NATO or ISAF forces. This is the 4th occasion on which Australia has been subject to a so-called green on blue incident. You might recall the terrible murdering of Lance Corporal Andrew Jones and as well the terrible incident which saw the death of Captain Duffy, Corporal Burt and Lance Corporal Gavin. We saw a separate 3rd instance where 3 Australian soldiers were wounded, and now we see this terrible incident where 3 Australian soldiers are killed and 2 wounded. That brings a total of 7 Australian fatalities as a result of so-called green on blue incidents or insider incidents, and some 12 woundings or casualties. There is nothing more terrible in conflict or in war than death, and there's nothing more terrible than when that occurs as a result of the actions of a person who comes from the country or the army whom you are trying to assist. But as I said in the Parliament recently, we should not judge an army or a nation on the actions of a small number of individuals. We've been subject to 4 such terrible events. Our NATO and International Security Assistance Force colleagues have been subject to many more in recent times. The Afghan National Security Forces now number some 300 to 350,000. So we're dealing here with a small number of incidences from a large landmass security force. Having said that, that does not take away the terrible blow. That does not take away the shudder that goes through the Australian Defence Force, the Australian Army and the Australian community when a terrible event like this occurs. Combined as it is with a helicopter crash which saw the taking of 2 Australian lives, this adds to the terrible feelings which we'll see in the Australian community both yesterday and today. And I say that because helicopter fatalities involving special forces evokes deep pain for our special forces colleagues and for the Australian Defence Force generally, as a result of earlier incidences in the past. So there could not be a worse combination of events. A helicopter crash involving fatalities for our special forces and an insider event, a green on blue event. And of all the terrible events that have come across my desk as Minister for Defence, of all the terrible events that have come across the desk of General Hurley since he has been Chief of the Defence Force, and of all of the terrible events that have gone across the desk of the Secretary of the Department, Duncan Lewis, there is no doubt that this is the worst. Such a terrible combination, and that will see significant reverberations through the Defence Force and through the Australian community. And I know as a result of the conversations I've had, not just with the Chief and the Secretary, but also with the Vice Chief, who has been acting in General Hurley's stead, and other members of the Department and the Defence Force, that there has been no greater shock, no greater pain that the Force has felt for many a long year. So far as the helicopter crash is concerned, that will of course be the subject of all of the usual inquiries, and again I'm not in a position to provide any further information so far as that is concerned. So far as the green on blue incident is concerned, I can advise that the Chief of Police of Oruzgan Province has named Sergeant Hek Matula as the alleged perpetrator, and he is currently being chased by a joint task force involving both Afghan National Security Forces and International Security Assistance Force, or ISAF forces. The International Security Assistance Force, of course, includes Australian personnel. Can I also indicate that in the early hours of this morning, I spoke to the commander of the International Security Assistance Force, General John Allen. General Allen, with whom Australia has a very close working relationship, firstly wanted to express his condolences, and I relay those to the Australian people. We also had a discussion about the steps and the measures that have been taken recently to seek to minimise the threat from these so-called green on blue or insider incidences. Some of you might recall that in the aftermath of the previous fatalities that I have referred to, General Hurley, in conjunction with General Allen and in conjunction with General Karimi, the head of the Afghan National Army, effected a review of all of our procedures. As a consequence of that, we have taken additional force protection measures, and they have been in place, and they have effectively been matched in more recent times by a wholesale review of force protection measures by General Allen. And these have been the subject of comment by him recently, and also by public comment from Leon Panetta, the Secretary of Defence for the United States, and also President Obama. So we are all only too well aware and conscious of the risks and of the additional steps that we have taken in recent times. General Hurley and I have made it clear in the past that we have and are taking additional force protection measures. We have not detailed those for all of the obvious reasons. In my conversation with General Allen, he made it clear that he has relayed to President Karzai and other senior Afghan officials the absolute essential need for the Afghan government and the Afghan National Security Forces, in conjunction with the International Security Assistance Force and NATO, to absolutely minimise the risk of future terrible events. A joint task force has been established, as I say, to track down Hek Matula. We are very pleased that the Afghan National Security Forces are lending their assistance very enthusiastically to that task, and their response in that respect has been first class. It's also the case that an investigative team from the Afghan National Security Force will arrive in Tarankot Friday morning Afghan time, to start the Afghan National Security Force investigation of this incident. A few moments ago, I received a call from Leon Panetta, Secretary of Defence for the United States. Mr. Panetta wanted to relay to me the condolence of the American people to Australia. He described Australia as its best friend in the Asia-Pacific, and he said that he very much felt the pain for Australia on such a terrible day. He was only too well aware of the significance of the number of fatalities and what that had meant in terms of our worst day in the field since Vietnam. He's asked me to personally convey to the Australian people his condolences and his expression to me that he and the American people feel our pain, and I do that. Can I also indicate that my New Zealand counterpart, Jonathan Coleman, has also indicated to me his deepest condolences. New Zealand, as you know, has been on the receiving end of 5 fatalities in the last fortnight. So I'm most appreciative of the expressions of support and condolence from our close friends and allies, New Zealand and the United States, and also from General Allen, the commander of the International Security Assistance Force.